This is the Birth, Baby, and Life podcast with Kristen Burgess, and we're taking a hard look at some abortion claims in episode number 213. Hey mamas, it is Kristen and I am back with another pretty heavy episode. We're going to be looking at some abortion claims, maybe a little bit of myth busting, I hope, in this podcast episode. If you don't know me, my name is Kristen and I am a pregnancy coach. I help mamas really enjoy their pregnancies, grow a really healthy baby, and prepare for a beautiful birth. I also help mamas who are trying to calm the chaos at home so that they can have a happy home and healthy, happy children living in it. So again, this is I started talking about this some in the last episode, and we're revisiting the topic again today. I did a full abortion episode a few podcast episodes ago, which I will link to below, and a lot of episodes kind of dealing with motherhood and our current political climate and cultural climate. And so all of this is really just a continuation of that discussion. I've received some feedback from listeners that I thought was important to address, and really, I think that the rhetoric, especially in the last election cycle, got totally out of hand because people started talking about pregnancy like it was some sort of deadly illness, like a cancer. And maybe some people really do think of it like a cancer because I get it that there's a new human being growing in your body. And on some levels, that's a little weird to think about, but also pretty miraculous and cool. Ironically, as we're going to talk about, microchimerisms are saving women's lives, and we'll come back and talk about that later in this episode. But really, I feel like we saw rhetoric and tragedies be weaponized in this cycle in ways that were inappropriate or misleading, and in some ways that actually end up being self-fulfilling prophecies, because you see things be weaponized about abortion or seeking legitimate medical care if there's a pregnancy complication or a complication from an abortion. And women are, I think the rhetoric is so strong that women are being scared away from seeking what they need to, or maybe that doctors are being scared to give life-saving treatment, though as we're going to talk about statutorily, they shouldn't be. So I think that if there's paranoia and fear, it's being caused by the rhetoric and not necessarily by the reality. So I want to dedicate a podcast episode to talking about that and elaborating a bit more on that and other issues that have come up in this entire debate, because I do think that it's important to talk about, because it gives us a chance to look at opposing viewpoints and also to clarify positions, to do research and that kind of thing. So again, I also want to remind people where I'm coming from. Like, if you're listening to this, I want you to realize that I'm not living in a mansion after a perfect life where I have not endured any hardship, okay? I'm a single mother of 8 children following unfathomable abuse. My children are from 2 dads, so I also have a failed marriage in there that was, partially my fault, being young and stupid. And then a second failed relationship, again, due to the abuse. I thought about bringing a picture and forgot to, but my first child was born in a single wide trailer in a dumpy trailer park in South Carolina. Okay, I grew up in a middle-class family, and I definitely took a step down when I got pregnant. I was married. We did marry when we found out that I was pregnant, but, we were living in a single-wide trailer. If I showed you pictures of this place, you would probably shudder. My baby girl was born in that trailer because I had a home birth. And, I kept it as clean as I could, but still, it was a ratty single wide trailer. And we called our landlords, as a husband and wife, called them the slumlords of the South, because that's just the kind of, I don't think they cared. They just wanted their money. And, so I was living at the poverty level. I had finished high school, but I was still a teenager. I dropped out of college to have my baby. So my life has not been roses. I've been below the poverty line for a lot of my children's lives. It has not been easy. I'm not coming from a place of this whole motherhood thing or giving my children life or anything like that has been easy, even because you could say, well, Kristen, you're the one who decided to have, 8 kids. So, but even from that very first baby where I chose life because I found out that I was pregnant at the health center on my university campus, and the first thing the doctor asked me was, would you like to schedule an abortion? And I said no, and I had my baby. And I am forever grateful for that grace and forever grateful for the gift that she has been, the teacher that she has been and continues to be in my life. So I wanted to give that for a little bit of perspective that, and then again, and also I went from, and I mentioned this on a previous episode, I went from being a homeschooling mom, homemaker who kind of ran this business on the side to a single mother who had not graduated from college, who had been a homemaker for 16 years at that point. And I'm still making it, so I have some perspective back from the trailer park and from being the statistic of the woman who, I couldn't depend on a man because he's in freaking prison now, right? There's some perspective there as I speak to young women about the realities of being a mom. And I realize that it's not easy. It's not easy. Most days I feel frustrated with my kids. Most days it's not easy, but would I change it? No, I wouldn't. But again, that's just to frame a little bit with where I'm coming from. So again, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about semantics, because when we talk about abortion, it's important to talk about semantics. So you may know this, you may not. It is true that a miscarriage in medical terminology is called an abortion. It is a spontaneous abortion, which is contrasted with usually the other term used is a therapeutic abortion. Okay, so a spontaneous abortion is different than what we think of as an abortion. And some women who have miscarriages are upset because they'll request their medical records for some reason, and then they'll read that it says abortion on there. And they say, no, I didn't have an abortion. But the reality is the medical terminology, semantically speaking, is an abortion. However, on this episode, when I say abortion, I am talking about choosing to terminate a pregnancy. And also, I believe that this is where I think semantics have been weaponized, especially in the past political cycle. If a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, for example, or if a woman is miscarrying, for example, and the ectopic pregnancy is removed, or she needs a D&C procedure because of the miscarriage. Technically, in the medical literature, those things may be labeled as an abortion, but they are not an abortion. A woman does not need an abortion to save her from an ectopic pregnancy. A woman needs a procedure to remove the ectopic pregnancy. A woman who is miscarrying needs a D&C, or sometimes medication will be used for a miscarriage that's already in process. But she doesn't need an abortion. Because none of those medical procedures outside of if you read your hospital records, I've been helping, read hospital records for my sweetie recently. And they use all kinds of terminology. Oh gosh, I can't remember it. You would not go say, my kids wouldn't tell me this morning when they got up, oh mama, I had epistaxis. I think it's epistaxis. Some of you who are in the hospital world know this better than me. Do you know what that is? It's a nosebleed. My kid never gets up and says that. My kid says, mama, I had a nosebleed, right? So sometimes there are things written in medical lingo that you just don't use in the popular vernacular. And so there was never a time in the past, my mom had an ectopic pregnancy removed. My mom said, I had an ectopic pregnancy. She did not say, I had an abortion. The conflation of all of that with an elective abortion or a therapeutic abortion or a termination, that's something that I believe has been done recently and intentionally to help blur lines in support of an agenda that's really focused on prioritizing abortion. Because I do think, and again, I think that's the agenda. The agenda is on prioritizing abortion because it seems like a tool that can be politically weaponized. And it's not necessarily a tool that actually supports women and their well-being. But again, I talked about that some on the first abortion episode, so you can go back and listen to that episode if you want my perspective there. But so again, I wanted to just touch on some things that have been really prominent narratives and rhetoric recently about abortion, and let's talk about that. And also with that semantic understanding about the semantics and the difference between a miscarriage and abortion, even though in medical literature miscarriage is called a spontaneous abortion, and also some of that conflation of issues that, again, when my mom had an ectopic pregnancy, she didn't say, I need to go in and have my abortion. That's just not the way that women talk about that kind of a pregnancy loss. And the conflation thereof is, I think, really deliberate to be able to advance an agenda that actually I don't really even think has a lot to do with women's health or well-being. I think it has a lot to do with politics. But anyways, so I thought that we would look over some things. I watched a great debate that I linked to it on the previous abortion episode, but I actually watched it right after I filmed that episode, and so I don't think I talked about it at all. But on the Ellen Fisher podcast, she had a doctor. I thought that I wrote her name down in my notes here, but I don't think so. But she had a doctor and a midwife, a pro-life doctor and a pro-choice midwife, come on and debate abortion. And it is just really, I think it's like an hour and a half long, but it is well worth your time to watch that. So please watch that. And they just did a great job. And so they do a much more detailed job than I'm probably going to do on this episode, but I thought that we would talk about some things. So we already touched a little bit on the definition of abortion. And then, when we look at people who believe that abortion is medically necessary, who believe in pro-choice, they give a really broad definition to abortion, including medically necessary interventions are under their abortion umbrella, even though traditionally when we think about a young woman who needs an abortion because she feels backed into a corner, that umbrella didn't include, like I said, the women who have an ectopic pregnancy or who are having a miscarriage or something like that. Today, all of those women are being grouped together in that one camp. But for people who hold the position that we're going to look at the life of mother and baby, and that abortion may not be medically necessary, because that's really what the argument comes down to on many levels, is we're talking about this because abortion is medically necessary and women are dying if they can't get their abortions, right? So to me, and I agree with this position, there is a difference between an elective abortion and a medical induction of an early delivery, whether that be an early delivery in the second trimester, whether that be in the first trimester with the D&C, or the removal of an ectopic pregnancy or something like that. An early delivery that is necessary for the life of the mother or because the baby has died is not an abortion. It is an early delivery. So that, again, is building on that semantic thing. So, again, ectopic pregnancy is one of those medically necessary things. But the intent of that procedure is to save the mother when her life is in danger. So that is an early end to that pregnancy. It's a removal of the pregnancy, but it's not an abortion. Again, I've said this a few times now, but my mom didn't go have an abortion. She wouldn't have gone to an abortion clinic. That's another thing to look at. You wouldn't go to an abortion clinic if you have an ectopic pregnancy. You're going to go to the emergency room and be treated in the hospital because it is a medical emergency and they have to remove the pregnancy due to the medical emergency. If you are not going to the abortion clinic for it, it is not the same thing as your everyday abortion, because this is a medical situation. So yes, ectopic pregnancy needs medical treatment, but medical treatment and abortion are not equal in this instance. Again, if there are severe fetal birth defects, that's something that is often cited as a necessity for an abortion. So again, you could say that is an early delivery thing, but you also have families that know that their child has a life-limiting anomaly who choose to continue to carry that child, either until the child dies in the womb, which sometimes they do, and then they may have labor induced early, or they may choose to carry to term and give birth to that baby. One of the hardest papers that I ever wrote, and I can see if I can find it because I actually ended up putting it up as a guest post on another website, and I'll see if she's still got it up. But was a post talking about when you know that your baby will not live. And it was an article about palliative care, essentially kind of hospice type care that a family could choose if they knew that their baby was not gonna survive birth or was only gonna live for a limited time after birth. There are a lot of resources out there for families who get this kind of a diagnosis. And some of those families think this is the only time, this pregnancy is the only time that I will get with this child. And it could be that fetal anomalies could cause other anomalies that could impact the mother's system, but usually, even if a baby has severe fetal anomalies, the mother's life is not at risk from carrying that baby. Now, if you knew that, for example, the baby was going to have something that made like a vaginal delivery difficult, for example, like hydrocephalus or something like that, maybe you would talk about an early induction or that kind of thing if you wanted to try and spare that surgical delivery. But again, all of those are questions that this shouldn't come under an umbrella of a discussion about abortion. This is a palliative care discussion. My dad was a palliative care chaplain and an ER chaplain for years and years and years before he retired. So this is more of a hospice palliative care conversation. This is not an abortion conversation. If you are pregnant with a baby with severe anomalies, you're probably not going to the abortion clinic. You're going to a maternal fetal medicine specialist, probably at a high level, probably a teaching institution in your state or municipality. And hopefully they have a hospice or palliative care team that is equipped to help you with the physical questions, with the mental, with the emotional, with the social supports. This is not an abortion clinic question. This is not an abortion clinic problem. So the solution to babies with severe anomalies is not abortion. It's palliative care and hospice. And again, often when a child is discovered to have these problems, this was a wanted pregnancy. So it's not a question. It's not a question of abortion. And if a woman did decide that she wanted to terminate a pregnancy for anomalies, I actually have a childhood friend who this happened to. He and his girlfriend or his lover, they had this problem, and then this was years ago. This was when I was pregnant with Cassidy, or right after she had been born, so years ago. And they ended up, because it was later term when they found out, they ended up traveling to another state because they did decide to go ahead and end the pregnancy. And so, traveling isn't necessarily something that's a new thing. But again, an option is you can choose to carry that baby, even if you know that baby is going to die. And if you know that you're having a severely disabled child, that's another question entirely. But many people find, and I'll revisit this too, many people find that, people with disabilities bring joy in life as well as challenges. So that's something to consider as well. When we look at things like preeclampsia, high blood pressure, peripartum cardiomyopathy. These are pregnancy complications like I talked about on the last episode. The pro-choice says, we need to abort because we've got to save the mom's life. But again, this one comes down to a semantical thing, because if you I don't even know if semantical is a word, semantic thing. If you have a mom who has preeclampsia, chances are she's in her second or third trimester. This is not an abortion question. She's not going to Planned Parenthood to take care of this problem. She's talking with her OB, with her maternal fetal medicine specialist. She's at the hospital, y'all. And so maybe she does need to have an induced labor. Maybe she does need to have a C-section. But the goal in that situation is to preserve both lives. It's not to say, oh my gosh, this mother is having this problem, so we're just going to get rid of the kid. It's not. And I say this, and I know for some of you who have had a termination in the past, or who had I had a mom reach out to me who had cancer and needed, again, to me, an early delivery to preserve her life. And she said it was hurtful, but sometimes I do feel like you need to be blunt when you talk about these things. So if that's triggering for you, please, forgive me, but understand also that I feel the need to be blunt on some of these issues. So again, if a mom has preeclampsia, peripartum cardiomyopathy, those kinds of things, the goal is to have a healthy live mother and a healthy live baby at the end. She's not going to Planned Parenthood. Abortion is not the conversation. And why today we've conflated that and made that a conversation, I just don't understand. And then there could be perhaps a later diagnosis, like I mentioned, something like trisomy 18 or another life-limiting or a diagnosis that'll cause the child to have severe disabilities. So the pro-choice side says, there will be, we'll reduce suffering, we'll reduce the pain, the emotional pain, the financial burden on the family and all of that. And a pro-life side says an intentional termination in that case isn't really justified because it's not to save the mother's life. And it's not necessarily to try and save the baby's life either. But palliative care options, again, can be looked at, can be sought, and support systems can be sought. And many families cherish those children and cherish their time with those children. I heard, it may have been on that podcast, the Ellen Fisher podcast that I was talking about, but she talks about how families say, my baby was born with Down syndrome, and that means that they were born with the joy gene, because you see that those young people are often very happy. And I know that when you're raising a disabled child, it can be a big deal. I mean, I've got kids who are on the spectrum, and there are times when it's very challenging. And I would not even say that that is a severe disability. I know that there are families that are dealing with so much more. And maybe they may make different decisions or think different things or bring different perspectives. But I think that when we have, and this kind of goes back to what I talked about in the last episode, when we have social support systems in place that can help ease burdens and can prioritize those families, so the conversation shifts away from what can we do to make sure these children are not born. At least I do think that if we are asking, like, what are teratogens and chemicals and stuff in our environment that are causing birth defects, that's a conversation that we should be having. But let's assume that it's not a preventable birth defect, it's just a random chance. Shifting the question away from should we even allow those children to be born to back towards how do we support those families and children, because it feels like we came from shut them all away in asylums and keep them out of the way, and then we went through a brief period of acceptance and integration in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s, and now it's right back to shut them away, but it's not shut them away, it's don't let them be born, because then there's no societal burden at all. And is that a question that we have? Is that a right that we have? And that comes to a core question with abortion, and I will admit that, and that people are going to come down on different sides of that debate. But also consider the fact that even if it's difficult, a child might enhance your life. And even if it's difficult, their life might bring enrichment to the world that you could not have perceived in your viewpoint and in your perspective. And that's really the question with all abortions. But it's one that becomes especially pertinent to talk about when we look at the fact, like, well, you could end up with a disabled child. And again, if you look at it, there's no guarantee. Like, if you have a healthy baby, statistically, you're more likely to have a healthy baby. But you have kids. Honor was telling me last night the story of the fellow who created Braille. Was a young kid playing with his father's metalworking tools, and he managed to get himself in the eye with one of them, and then it had an infection that spread to the other eye, and he became blind. And so, there's no guarantees in life about our wholeness or our ability. We may, people become paralyzed or they have problems that happen. And ultimately, that does come down to a question of what is your belief on the value of human lives and in relation to your life and your freedom and that kind of thing. And I'm not saying it's an easy question, but just putting it out there. And then, of course, there's psychological impact on the mom. You might say, well, this pregnancy is at a bad time for her, et cetera, et cetera. And so, it's better for her to be able to abort. But many women experience trauma post-abortion, and many women have regret and that sort of thing later on. And that's something that's not talked about. You have like TikTok videos that are celebrating abortion, and maybe some of those are in jest or in poor taste, but I mean, it's something to really think about. And this is one of the things in all of the motherhood series that I did recently where I don't even think I mentioned abortion, but some of it was speaking to all these issues where we tell young women that their career is the ultimate fulfillment in life, and that they need to pursue the career and the dollar and being part of the workforce as the ultimate fulfillment, and that motherhood is going to get in the way. Well, I mean, where is your mental health going to be when that's what you believe? And how does that impact your mental health if a pregnancy is celebrated as the end of your life rather than, a beautiful beginning? And I think that's a big problem. It's why, if any of my daughters or even sons were to come to me and say that, they're in a relationship that's resulted in an unplanned pregnancy, I tell them, a baby's always a blessing. And that's hard, sometimes, because I wrestle with the thought, what if my kids gets pregnant or gets somebody knocked up and they don't want to be responsible? And then, but the baby's here, and what would I do? Would I step up and take care of the baby? And it's like, I've thought about the fact that, I've been mothering for 20 years now, and I've still got another lot of years to go because my youngest is only 7. In reality, I'd have another baby too if I could. But, it's like, what if I end up raising a grandbaby? I'm never going to be stopped mothering. But to me, it's like, what? What else is worth it in life except for human relationships at the end of the day? What is more important than being in a loving relationship and being part of a family and that sort of thing? I guess my perspective on that has just really, really been molded maybe by the fact that I'm in a family, but it's just so important to me, to be there for humans. And I think even when we see many people who chose to stay childless, at least in the past, their lives were often dedicated to some sort of bettering of humanity on the whole. So again, I won't wax too much poetic. So some more specific examples too, again, looking at the health thing, is C-section scars and that kind of thing. So what if there's a C-section scar complication and that's threatening to the mother's life? But even with a placenta accretia or something like that, again, this is something that we're looking at. This problem is coming later in pregnancy. So the goal is, even if there needs to be life-saving measures, to have a healthy mother and a healthy child. A woman with these kinds of complications is not going down to Planned Parenthood. And another thing that this makes the case for is discussing not how do we have more abortions, but how do we lower the C-section rate so that women have fewer C-section scars. Again, we talked about Down syndrome. Again, I have it listed here, but Down syndrome individuals can bring significant value and joy, and we devalue the contribution that they can bring to families in our society. Cancer, I mentioned this already. Cancer treatment and ending of a pregnancy because a woman needs cancer treatment is not an abortion. Like, the woman is not going to Planned Parenthood for her abortion and her chemotherapy. Again, chemotherapy is life-saving for the mother. And the secondary effect of chemotherapy is that the baby is probably not going to survive it. That is not an abortion. That is a tragedy. That is something to mourn. And the fact that a situation like that gets co-opted as part of an argument, to me, that's devastating, because you take the legitimate pain and fear, even terror, of families going through that, and then you use it as a poster child for an issue that is really not the same. A woman contemplating an abortion because she doesn't feel like she can handle a baby right now is not the same as a woman in a pregnancy who realizes she's got cancer and has to undergo treatment that the baby isn't going to survive. Those are two very different situations, and they should not be put together when we're discussing them. So again, it's just really important to differentiate between terminology, to look at these situations clearly, to understand the role of shifting the conversation and the dialogue, of looking at prevention rather than just early monitoring, and looking at things like reducing the cesarean rate, like looking at how do we support women as being mothers? How do we have healthier moms and babies? How do we provide more support when women become mothers? How do we shift the narrative about motherhood so that women who want to be moms, which is like 95% of women, can look for career paths that are flexible and allow for mothering, and a society that supports that, instead of encouraging everybody that you need to follow this really male kind of path that is focused on build, because men kind of go through that. They go through this kind of playful phase when they're young men, and then this kind of apprenticey learning phase, testing out different things, and then they find a career path that seems to fit them, and they like lock in and they build. You hear wives complain about that a lot. But that's just the phase that they're in. And then they get to this place where they've reached a level of success, and they kind of level off and may pull back and look more at family and that kind of thing, even if they've been tried to be balanced before. But the problem for women with following that same path is, if the woman wants to be a mother, by the time she gets out of that build phase to the phase where there's an establishment and she's more relaxed, she often cannot have children anymore. And it's harder for a woman, if she does have children in that build phase, to tear herself apart from them. And so what we need to look at is, how do we find career paths and shape the world so that there's not just a place for women, for the male focus, but also for what women need. And these are the kind of questions that I talked about previously. Mary Harrington and others are looking at answers to those questions. But fundamentally, those are the kinds of things we need to ask, like I talked about in the last episode. How can we make this safer? And then when we're talking about language, like, look at semantics and look at the situation that you're saying a woman needs an abortion in, and ask yourself, if she has this problem, is she going to the hospital or is she going to the abortion clinic? Because if it's a true medical emergency and she's going to the hospital, that's not an abortion. That's a pregnancy complication. That's an early delivery, or that's a tragedy where a baby cannot survive the treatment that the mother receives. So those are important ways to look at it. And we also need to look at, that there are support systems. So we're going to come back to support systems in a minute. So let me not veer into that too much, but we'll talk about that again. So again, it's just, there are many, many, many ethical, healthy ways to help women in these situations that don't necessarily rely on abortion. Now, I want to take a minute, too, to talk about statutory protection of mothers' lives, because that's another issue that's been raised a lot with the hot rhetoric in this political cycle. When we look at statutorily what's going on to protect women's lives, the truth and the reality is that women's lives are protected in every state in the United States. And there have been a lot of media narratives that are trying to make it seem that this is not the case. And I feel like it's important to rebut them, because the media narratives are literally dangerous. They may literally be stopping women from seeking medical treatment when they need it, because they're afraid that they won't get treatment, that they're afraid that they'll be prosecuted, and those kinds of things. And none of this stuff is true. And when I got some feedback from a podcast listener, she suggested that I be willing to say a particular name, which I'll come to, but I'll say more than one name, because we have women who have been held up as examples of this. So, sorry, I just lost my notes, so I'm just turning back to my notes here. So, for example, we've got Amber Thurman, Candy Miller, and then Jocelyn Barnica is the one that my reader wrote me about, or my listener wrote me about. So when we look at all of these women's stories are being held up as reasons why limited ability to get an abortion in a given state has endangered women's lives. But if we look at this, that's not necessarily what was going on with these women. So, for example, Amber Thurman had what appears to be a uterine infection. She needed a DNC, and so I found a few articles because I want y'all to be able to have written documentation of this too. But it says, in Amber's case, her physicians apparently did not recognize the urgency of her situation until it was too late, possibly because abortion advocates misrepresent abortion drugs as safe and effective and discourage women from telling ER doctors if they had a DIY abortion. So again, and then many articles are saying that a DNC procedure, this happened in Georgia, is criminalized in Georgia, And that is not the case at all. There is no state in the United States that criminalizes a D&C when a woman's life is in danger. Georgia law provides exceptions and says that in a medical emergency, or if there is no heartbeat, then the baby can be removed. And that was the case for this woman. So why her team did not act, maybe they were scared, maybe they didn't have a clear picture of the situation. I had a male child, who had an issue in the emergency room that caused me to really think through, because I didn't go to the back with him because he was over 18 at that point. But, he was a young person, and they missed what could have been a life-threatening. Like, they actually missed what was going on. We went home with a diagnosis that was incorrect, came back the next day when he was much worse. Sepsis had set in, the infection was septic. He could have died because the emergency room missed the diagnosis. But I think that ultimately it was his inability to really clearly describe exactly what was going on. And I feel like the hospital was at fault because they didn't check all the boxes, dealing with a young man who's a teenager who is having problems in an area that, makes him feel a little bit nervous. They should have gone through, had a checklist and said, let's ask about all of these things when they were doing their differential diagnosis. And so in an emergency room, should they have a checklist that says, have you taken an abortion pill? If a person is presenting, a woman, let me say a woman, if a woman is presenting with particular symptoms, I believe so. But so I think there was some medical negligence here to at least not look at the possibility that could be what was going on. But the reality is many experts have looked at this and have said this was medical negligence. This was not and the medical negligence was probably also because of the way that the abortion was given, that was kind of under the table and that kind of thing. And then the other woman, Candy Miller, did not seek medical care because I think she feared prosecution. And that is also false. Women will not be prosecuted for having an abortion. And I got all of the political flyers from this past election cycle, and many of them had stuff like that printed on it, like, vote one way if you don't want prosecution. And so if you don't want an abortion criminalized. And so the implication there is for women who are seeking an abortion and who have a complication, because there are complications from abortion, especially abortion drugs. There are complications that happen. And if a woman has been told she's going to be prosecuted if she goes to get medical care, she's not going to go get medical care. And that is literally misinformation. And then the young woman, Jocelyn Barnica, I'm again going to read a quote. This quote is from Ingrid Skopp, who's an OBGYN. She says, as a board-certified OBGYN practicing in Texas, I'm saddened to hear of Jocelyn Barnica's tragic and preventable death. Based on the information publicly available, doctors should have immediately intervened when she presented to the hospital with an inevitable and incomplete miscarriage at 17 weeks gestation. Her physician's failure to intervene caused her death. Under Texas pro-life law, a physician may end a pregnancy when, in his or her reasonable medical judgment, a pregnancy complication places a woman in danger of death or a serious risk of some substantial impairment of a major bodily function. So even more than a dozen obstetric specialists who reviewed Jocelyn's records agreed that her care violated professional medical standards. No physician has been prosecuted for performing an abortion for the life of the mother post-obs. The post-abortion lobby's fear-mongering, paired with the lack of guidance from professional medical associations and hospitals, are harming women. And one thing to note, reasonable standards or reasonable judgment, that reasonable medical judgment is commonly used throughout the medical world, like in regulations and bulletins and that kind of thing that come out from various medical societies and boards and colleges and all that kind of thing. So this is not language that doctors wouldn't understand. This is language that they see very standard. And again, if providers are not acting, that's either negligence or maybe there's some fear there, but it's just not true. And I'm going to link to a page that literally gives the statutory language for every state that has restrictions on abortion, so that you can read the statutory language yourself and see that the mother's life is protected in every state. And I was also going to see if I could get this to play. Again, I don't know how to do it on the screen, so I'm going to play it on my phone, but I'll also see if I can embed embedded on the show notes page so that you can see it. But this, I thought, was a great little video that shows us that this is just not happening.
Are there any states where women face prosecution for having an abortion?
No.
Are there any states that criminalize miscarriage?
No.
Or that care for a miscarriage?
No.
Are there any states that criminalize removing an ectopic pregnancy?
No.
Are there any states that prohibit life-saving care for the mother?
No.
Are there any states where women have to be actively dying for a doctor to be able to act for her care?
No.
There's been a lot of rhetoric in this that I'm concerned pushes people away from getting access to health care. Vice President Harris, in a speech recently, said that women were being arrested and facing prosecution for experiencing miscarriages. Ms. Hackler, do you know of a single instance where a woman has been arrested for having a miscarriage or getting health care for that?
No, treatment for miscarriage is allowed under the law, and there have been instances where I think that one example of that that's been pointed to is misleading, because the woman, I think she was in Ohio, the charges against her were not abortion related, and so it's misleading to use that as an example.
It's not only misleading, but it scares women away from getting access to health care. And it leads women to not go get health care treatment when they desperately need it.
Okay, so I just thought that was a nice, succinct little video that talks about this issue. So let's pivot now again. And like I said, I am going to link to the statutory language, and I did want to share those examples because the examples have been held up, but when you look at them and look at reality and also look at the fear-mongering and rhetoric that, like the legislature was saying right there, that seems to be keeping women from actually going and seeking care, then that's the problem. The problem may not be the restrictive laws. I mean, you could say that if I have to go a state over or a couple states over or whatever, and you could argue that when women, order abortion drugs off the internet or something rather than being supervised, and how do we look at that issue? How do we talk about that issue and help women stay safe if that's a situation that they feel that they need to be in? But that is a different discussion than saying, okay, you know what, if you do this and then need help, you're going to get prosecuted. We need to stop doing that, and we need to stop really fear-mongering in a way that apparently seems to be impacting the judgment of medical providers. Though again, I just don't understand, because the other thing is like you have obstetricians every single day who do all kinds of stuff that people don't want them to do, and they just do it because it's what they feel is best. So I don't understand why they wouldn't in these situations, unless, again, they didn't understand the full scope of the situation to intervene, like seems to have happened with these women in Georgia, or like I mentioned, seemed to happen with my son as well. He had to go for emergency surgery to fix the problem, by the way, when we went for the second ER visit. So, that sort of thing happens even outside of pregnancy and birth. So what we need is clear checklists that help us say, are we looking for every differential diagnosis? And are we looking at every single issue and treating it? But again, kind of coming back to the statutory language, I'm going to link. So if you want to, you can read the statutory language for every state. And as he said, it is not true that a mother needs to be on her deathbed before she can receive treatment, or before there can be a treatment that may end up resulting in the loss of life from a baby. That's not true. Every woman can be treated when she needs to be treated in every single state. So pivoting away from that to talk about something else that's needed is looking at support. So one of the things that I believe that we really need to do is we really need to build support for women who are mothering. And I think that we do need to continue to support women in unplanned pregnancies. And I don't believe that allowing organizations to build robust support for women in unplanned pregnancies is at all an anti-woman thing to do. Because many women will say that their lives are enhanced by their children and by mothering. So we have a pregnancy support in our area where women can go. I mean, it's typical for a pro-life establishment. Women can go get an early ultrasound, but I'm just so impressed by the work that they are doing, because they're not just there to tell you, okay, well, don't have an abortion, have the baby, you're good, or here's a pack of diapers, good luck. That's not what they do. They present options. They do an ultrasound, because many women, when they see the baby on the ultrasound, will stop and think about whether they really want to have an abortion or not. And I don't think that's a bad thing. If you're all for being really clear and transparent, well, how much clearer and transparent can you be than letting a woman see the child that's living within her and make a decision with that level of knowledge? Why would you hide that from women? Or why would you say that you shouldn't do that? It just doesn't make sense. Let her truly make an informed decision, right? So that they present options, they talk about options, that standard thing. But then if a woman decides to continue her pregnancy, they are there for her every step of the way. They have mentorship program that goes on through pregnancy into parenthood and beyond. They also have a mentorship program for the dads. They offer supplies. If a woman comes and gets support, they actually give her baby an entire dresser that is full of clothes and supplies for the baby. So everything that the baby needs is there, as well as maternity clothes and other supplies. They help, they help support women by helping them understand other resources and things that are available in the community, and just tapping into those resources, whether that be housing assistance or assistance with food or that kind of thing. My community, I feel like, there's some lack there, but I feel like it has a fairly robust support system, especially when it comes to pregnancy and baby's first year, because you've got the pregnancy center that's there. You've got agencies that can help with social support. We have a maternal infant health program that goes all the way through pregnancy, through the baby's first year, and can actually go further if necessary. For example, when everything went down in my family, when my ex-husband was arrested, Phoenix was 6 months old, and I was able to have the maternal infant health program continue coming out until he was 18 months old, because they just knew that I needed extra support, and having the social worker come out was just lifesaver to me, because she was amazing. I had already built a relationship with her over a previous pregnancy, and so just having her come out and be in my corner was wonderful. So we have support systems like that, and many areas do. Now, we talked on the last episode about maternity care deserts and that kind of thing. So I do think there's limitations, which is one of the reasons why we need to focus on building robust support systems and that kind of thing. But many of these support systems are already there. So I used our pregnancy center as an example, and I will link to them in the show notes too. And in case you happen to be in Northern Michigan, they're there. But, mentorships, a welcoming place, connection with community resources, supplies as they are needed, assistance with figuring out how to navigate things like, do I want to go to college? What career would support me? And figuring out relationship issues. Like I said, they have mentoring for dads, like sorting out family stuff. All of that support is there. And oftentimes, women really just need foundational support. And then you are able to figure things out, or you're able to tap into support. And all of this is really community-based. So what we need is to look at our communities and look at what our communities can do to support mothers, to support children, and all of those things. And I will be the first to admit, I actually put in my notes here, can we do better? And I wrote, hell yes, we can do better. But I think real solutions do begin by shifting away from the narrative or paradigm that pregnancy and babies ruin your life, or they're dangerous, so get an abortion, to talking about, okay, 95% of women want to become moms, and 95% of women will become moms. And what do we do to support these women when that's going on, and to let them know that they're loved, to let them know that these support systems are there? And maybe some of them will still choose not to become mothers, but at least we will know that there is a robust support system there, and we will not attack people who want to have that robust support system there, because many women want to have their babies, even when they become pregnant unexpectedly. And we just need to totally shift the narrative about the medical necessity and this, that, and the other, or, that a woman who's having a medical emergency needs to go for an abortion. That's just not true. We need to not talk about that. So let's also talk a little bit about health protections, which You may know this already, especially if you're listening, but there are some things that moms do that are ultimately protective of their health. We know that breastfeeding is protective of health. Pregnancy seems to be protective of health. Something that's exciting and newly being researched is microchimerism, which is when cell-free fetal DNA is circulating in a mother's blood. And we believe that on the whole it's positive. There is some research that shows that could this cause autoimmune issues for some moms? Yes, but the research seems to be genuinely or generally positive. So some different areas where this is, just trying to make sure I can look at all my notes here. Where we see this is for breast cancer. There is a lower incidence of breast cancer in women who have breastfed, and ovarian cancer. There seems to be a lower risk of ovarian cancer if women have been pregnant and breastfed, and especially seems to be tied to longer duration of breastfeeding. Endometrial cancer is at a lower incidence for women who have been pregnant. Part of that is because pregnancy suppresses menstrual cycles. It reduces overall lifetime estrogen exposure. Is that what we think? Or is what we think? This one's an interesting one. Women who have been pregnant seem to have a lower risk of type 2 diabetes, especially if they have breastfed, because breastfeeding seems to improve insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity, as I said in the last episode, seems to really be one of the root causes of disease. Women who have been pregnant seem to be at lower risk of cardiovascular disease later. They have reduced risk for heart disease and stroke later in life. We believe that pregnancy-related metabolic adaptations and breastfeeding may improve long-term heart health, possibly because they help reduce fat stores and they improve, again, that blood sugar and blood pressure regulation. Osteoporosis, women who breastfeed are at lower risk for osteoporosis in life because pregnancy and lactation help lay down calcium and ultimately result in stronger bones. Women who have breastfed seem to have less metabolic syndrome. That's related to insulin sensitivity. So just women's metabolism is improved with breastfeeding. Women do seem to have lower rates of autoimmune disorders if they have been pregnant or breastfeeding, because it seems to modulate immune function and may be protective against autoimmune, which is kind of the body starting to attack itself. And then mental health may ultimately be better for moms because breastfeeding, especially with breastfeeding moms, there is a lot of mother-infant bonding. There's a boost in oxytocin, and sometimes some research has shown that pregnancy and breastfeeding can improve stress resilience. So I'll link to a couple articles that talk about this, but it's really interesting. And then microchimerism, which I wanted to talk about. When I talked about the quote, I think I opened the last episode with a quote about how, the goal of the fetus is really to protect the mother's life. And that quote was in the context of looking at microchimerism, which is this cell-free fetal DNA that floats in the mother's bloodstream and seems to have protective effects. So fetal cells actually integrate into the mom's body, and they can be found in the mother's organs and persist for decades. Fetal cells can potentially repair heart damage. So if a mother has experienced heart damage, the fetal cells can repair that. And cells may migrate widely, and they help assist in repairing tissues. It happens when the mom is pregnant with the baby. In fact, I'm going to see... I didn't write anything about it, but I will link to the study that talks about this. But a woman actually aborted a baby boy and later had liver disease, and her liver rebuilt itself. And the researchers were trying to figure out what happened because her liver cells' DNA did not match hers. And they realized that it was most likely from that aborted baby, which is pretty profound to think about, when you think about that. So this is another quote. I think, so here's Hina Chaudhry's quote from Mom Genes by Abigail Tucker. This is the one I opened the last podcast episode with. The fetus is designed to protect the mother. And then Abigail Tucker follows with this. In addition to our hearts, fetal cells may mend mom's flesh wounds. Fetal cells likely pack many C-section scars, for instance, and help shelter us from myriad disease. One decade-long Dutch study tracked 190 women in their 50s and 60s, and those with detectable leftover baby cells were less likely to die of virtually everything. It's even been proposed that these swarming stem cells slow the aging process. No $300 per ounce face cream required. So, in this episode, I've talked about a number of different things that have been brought up in all of the recent abortion-focused rhetoric. And I've hopefully rebutted or at least given some thoughts for consideration on some of those, especially looking at medical necessity for abortion, the semantics of abortion, and looking at statutory language and how that does, in fact, protect mothers' lives, and how we're looking at medical negligence or fear that is what is truly endangering mothers' lives, and how if we shift the narrative to create clarity and professional guidance and oversight that's needed, maybe we can stop some of those deaths that were due to fear or ignorance or rhetoric that is just not true. And then we also, we need to this is part of that greater conversation of women's lives and motherhood and the stories that we tell women and the value that we put on mothers and mothering, and because when we believe that a career track is inherently more valuable than mothering, we end up with rhetoric that tells women that being a mom is limiting to their lives. And I guess I feel like, I think I put it in here in my notes, but I was thinking about this song, oh gosh, it's I Lived by One Republic. I thought I wasn't going to be able to remember the words, but it's I did it all. That's the line in the song. And really, why is it so bad to consider that a full life would include mothering and children, and could include mothering and children before building the almighty career? Because that seems to be a thing, as we want to establish the career and then we want to be the moms, and so we need to abort the babies that come before we can complete that. And again, I say that flippantly, and I hope it's not a flippant decision for most people, but I hope that there has been, clarity, and I hope that semantically speaking, this has been helpful. And I hope that understanding statutes and understanding medical necessity and that sort of thing, there's been clarity. And I hope that we've seen that there are support systems in place. And I hope that we can shift our discussions to what can we do to make pregnancy and birth safer for mothers? What can we do to support moms so that mothering is very fulfilling and enjoyable? I hope that we can make some of the shifts away from this literal life versus death conversation that focuses on the only way to win is the death of the child, to more, how can we create win-win situations where both people are able to thrive? If we're looking at asking how can humanity flourish going into the future, we should ask, how can we flourish as mothers, as children, as communities, as families? Everything, especially in the United States today, is so hyper-focused on the individual and what will fulfill the individual that we forget that where we actually thrive and where we're actually fulfilled is in community, it's in family, it's in all of these things. And that's not universal for everybody, but it really is for most people. So let's have those conversations, accurate conversations about healthy moms and healthy babies and healthy communities and healthy families. And how do we do those things without having to weaponize or scare tactic into getting what we want? Instead, we need to look at how do we support everybody in this. So I hope this episode's given you some thinking points. In the next episode, I'm going to respond to another listener request for my wisdom from 8 pregnancies and 8 births. So that'll be a little bit of a lighter episode, and that will be good. I will talk to you soon.